We've had an excellent first round. We had a lot of substantial questions. We also spoke about the technicalities and the interpretation and the effect that the investment package might have. Now we are going to talk about some of the things which have already been discussed, and that relates to monitoring. Because such a big investment package, of course, which is going to have an impact in various different ways, we expect that we get a very good overview of what's actually happening and what's going on, and that the funds which are earmarked for particular purposes will actually be spent on them. And another topic which we have not yet discussed so far has to do with communication. Because you want people to feel what's going on, you want to make it tangible. And with regards to the diversity of things which are happening, it's not all that easy, and also with regards to the diversity of measures to be implemented and strategies to be adopted. Now, how can you turn this investment package into something that actually reaches out to the people and is being conceived as being something that really makes a lot of sense? Because, of course, we have to increase our debt rate, which is something that people are always very critical about. After the investment package was adopted, people spoke more about the debt package rather than anything else. And this is a major challenge because we have to make people understand that it makes sense to incur additional debts. We've got excellent experts here looking at things from various different angles. Now let me introduce KATJA RIETZLER from the IMK Institute for Macroeconomic Research in Düsseldorf, one of the two institutions which back then was involved in the big first estimates. Mr. Hüther is here, director of the Institute for German Economic Affairs. Secondly, back then, he was also involved in the desk because this is a company which is close to the employers, and they jointly came up with the solution, which is not normally the case. Jakob von Weizsäcker is the finance minister of the federal state of Saarland, the initiator of the round of economists who came together and provided a stimulus in spring for the adaptation of this investment package. It's very interesting to hear from you what you've got to say. And then we have Laura Krause here with us, working in the Federal Ministry of Finance. And she is particularly well experienced in the field of monitoring. MIRKO, DERPMANN is here from SCHOLZ and Friends. They normally come up with publicly well-accepted strategies. Now, can you provide us with some insights on how do you want to do it and how do you not want to do it? Jakob von Weizsäcker, would you like to start off? Yes, I'm happy to do so. Now, we'd like to start about talking the question of how can you ensure that in the course of enforcement with the 500 billion, something good will be achieved? And how can you spread the news? How can you make this public? I'm lucky enough to be the Minister of Finance in the small federal state of Saarland. And a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we had 3 billion for a transformation fund that was created. Back then, we were wondering what's important for governance? What's important in order to make things run smoothly? And let me inform you about some of the instruments. Some of these components have also been implemented at the national level. They have either been materialized and put into practice, or as the right approaches have been embarked upon. First thing, that's very important. I think we have to zoom in on the situation at the ministerial level, but we also have to have a special institution responsible for such a big fund. In the Saarland, we were first of all full of praise because with a special fund, we managed to attract the investment of a big chick manufacturer, Wolfspeed. So we tore down an old coal plant and we asked this company to come there. And all of a sudden we learned they're not willing to come. And this is what also happened in other federal states with regards to microelectronics. And we did not make many investments that were not made, but in the doing we tried to see to it that we said, well, of course, there are no specific investments that have to be made for a particular user, but this is something which is really fair, and if somebody else comes along, we'll be more than happy. So a strong region, how can you assure that with regards to various different fields of applications, that there's always things that can go wrong? So you always have to track and trace. 500 billion, you see, that's really worth it. Then the question, of course, is, can you use 5 people to do the job? In my department, it was only 2 people, but we only had 3 billion available, you see. But this is what is most important. The first instinct is that you say, well, we've got a budget department, the Federal Ministry of Finance. We also have people who are economists who look at the individual ministries and take care of the situation there. It will be interesting from the lady to my right to hear how new structures can be developed. How can we make sure that we get things going, keep everything under control, so we don't have to have a particular institution in place that really exerts control, but we need to make sure that things function smoothly. That's one point. The second point, which is equally important, has already been implemented completely. In the Transformation Fund of the Saarland, we have an advisory council, and the advisory council consists of people who have various different perspectives. Monika Schnitzer, Lars Feld, Jens Südekom, Maria Göpel, Mr. Gusum Petri. Those of you who are interested in technology will have heard about him. And we also have other excellent experts coming from the Saarland. But you can easily imagine, to me, as a Minister of Finance, with regards to those things which are not really convincing, and this happens, you see, because we have 500 million, or rather 3 billion. You know, some people tend to say no. And my reply is, well, if we don't say no, then we'll get into trouble in the advisory council. So I can actually hide behind these people. And that's good, because these are good people. They're not really responsible. So don't get me wrong. They're not responsible for the decisions, but they provide advice and recommendations. And such an advisory council is really helpful for political reasons, in order to see to it that there are certain demarcation lines that need to be complied with. You know, if you sit there in the middle of the night, and if you try to find the right projects to spend your billions on, that's quite difficult. Second point, we've already discussed how difficult it was to breathe life into the concept of at the national level, and additionality is a rather difficult concept, but we said in the Saarland it's quite simple. We raised the investment level in the core budget by at least 1 percentage point, and now we even managed to bring it up by 2%. And we didn't want people to be led to believe, you know, that there are vested interests, but we do more in the core budget because it's important to bring about transformation with regards to the investment as well. And then we have the special fund in addition to that. That also holds true for the 100 billion that are allocated to the federal state. Here too we will get some funds, but we're not going to decrease the investment level. There is a fourth point I'd like to raise. And we are doing some things in this regard, but not as good as the national government should do. I think this is probably a marketing task. But why don't we look at the concrete projects that we want to implement, that people really have a very specific idea about? I can imagine what an investment quota is all about, but most people don't have a clue. Why not say that this will be added up on top? Certain things will be deducted. Subsidies for climate and transportation will have to be deducted. That's what we have to do according to the experts in the expert council. For example, if you don't do it right in the field of procurement, because the construction prices for the German railway company are much higher than they are elsewhere, then you can deduct this. But still, a lot will remain. Not only the macro observation is important, because it will only be of extra benefit to the export. How did we manage to bring our own house in order in line with the investment clock? If I had a wish free, this would be my desire. And one last idea before I come to a close. What we discussed during the first panel related to the question of credibility. How credible is it that these 500 billion will really give a boost to the economy and make us take a step forward, so that we can also say with a good conscience, in the interest of the following generations, we are not doing the wrong thing, but we are doing the right thing? That is very important per se. But it is also very important for a process that we have not yet really mentioned in today's discussion, and that's with the reform of the debt reg. The decisions that were made, and Michael and others slightly alluded to that, and they helped prepare it, was an ad hoc solution. And it was really important to do it in this particular way. But the question is, what will happen next? And the quality of the implementation of projects with regards to the 500 billion will contribute to the fact whether a two-thirds majority can be generated. Will we be able to create a mood in the country where people say, well, this was something that was developed with farsightedness. If the money is being spent properly, we will all benefit from that. Or will people rather say, now here we go again. In theory, it sounds good, but in practice, it doesn't work out that way. So therefore, I hope that this will provide an extra incentive for us to be disciplined as far as we can. And let me close on a rather positive note. The mayor of Spremberg said everybody's always saying that we've got to do away with red tape, but things are getting worse. But the sword of Damocles of the 500 billion over the heads of the bureaucratic and federal slow processes in Germany is particularly strong, because everybody's really afraid we'll really be able to make it in 12 years. 12 years are a long period of time, but will we be able to get there? This is really great incentive. So we all in the different institutions benefit from that, because the idea of saying, well, increasing debt impairs the reforms is wrong, because increasing debt helps us bring about reforms. Thank you.
Well, Laura Krause, you could give us an answer what the Federal Ministry of Finance and you are planning at the moment and already got going. Well, thank you very much. It looks like we talked about it before, but we met for the first time today. But obviously, we are quite good when it comes to communication. Anyway, another Undersecretary of State was a panelist already. There are the different budgets, there are the different departments for the lender in the ministry. But my job is slightly different, because my sub-department focuses on citizens and the impact on citizens. This figure, 500 billion, is in my office. I wrote it down because people hardly ever write it down and spell it out. In the Ministry of Finance, people are used to working with big figures. But in our external communication, we have to be very careful, because normal people cannot imagine 1 billion, how much that is. But they cannot imagine either what 500 billion are. So the economic situation, the situation of the infrastructure has already been mentioned, but the special fund is also a reaction to a lack of satisfaction or increasing dissatisfaction in our country. We usually have this discussion on a very academic level regarding investment ratios, etc. But we're not really communicating it very well. The package is a response to the mood in the country. And how can it actually influence that mood? And that brings me back to monitoring. Of course, we pursue monitoring, first of all, to see whether this special fund is having the effect it's supposed to have, whether it can be dispersed, where are the obstacles. And that is why we have now an advisory board that, together with people who do their practical job every day, can tell us where things have always been complicated and didn't work. If we invest the 500 billion into the old system without changing it, it will not get us anywhere. Modernization of the state is also one of my remits. And what you just said is absolutely correct. These are two sides of the same coin. If we don't modernize, the 500 billion will only be dispersed very slowly and will reach the railroads, the roads, and the internet networks at a very late point in time. We want to change the image of government also with these packages. When we practice monitoring, we have to organize it across all the different departments, among experts and non-experts, and we have an overarching interdisciplinary process. We need different perspectives, macroeconomic views and indicators, but also people like me who've dealt with democracy, trust, and the state for a long time. And exactly what you did has to be done. We have to ask the question, how can we achieve our targets? And a great challenge in this context is that, of course, in the different areas of investment, the speed is different. Sometimes you feel the impact immediately, sometimes you don't. We have to have truthful and honest communication with people. We cannot promise them that the world will change in 3 months, because we are not the real investor. We just make the funds available. It's the lender, the local authorities, and the different other ministries that actually spend the money and can control the process. So we try to be a strong hub, but we also have to be cooperative, and we have to be in a position to tell and explain to people what this means in practice. So it's absurd, but we have to do away with figures. We have to show what's behind the figures. My personal theory is people will otherwise say, I haven't really felt the impact of these billions yet. People keep talking about these billions and the additional spending quotas or whatever, but I don't feel them. We think this investment is an answer to the dissatisfaction among the population, so we have to focus on explaining it to them. Thank you very much. Maybe we come back to storytelling. Michael Hüther, you discussed it very intensively. How can people be made to understand that this is something for them? The EU for a long time spent structural funds and other financial means by advertising them, having large signs in building and construction projects, etc. And there are studies that show that this had an impact on the public understanding and perception. So how can we do that with these investments? Well, we did it also in the German Unity Fund. There was a logo and people saw, here is an investment by the government in connection with this fund. So we have to have a good logo, we have to have a good slogan. Of course, there will be other measures necessary, but when it comes to effectiveness, I would like to make another remark. When we discussed it in this group of 4, what is possible, we combined both aspects. We said an infrastructure special fund because we identified these gaps. In 2019 and 2025, we carried out our calculations and nobody ever challenged that. None of my colleagues said the debt brake cannot be touched because how do we get the money otherwise? Everything was done relatively smoothly in the discussion phase, but now people want to know how the measures can be effective. And the exemption, the defense exemption, is problematic here. The whatever it takes story is something that people can understand, and we cannot touch this with a debt brake. But it must be clear in the long run, defense spending has to come from the budget. There was a person here in the room who said, well, I have to explain why we made all these mistakes. We said, do some front loading, increase the special funds, and this is the fiscal challenge we have. How can the defense spending be sustainably reintegrated into the budget? But the actual effectiveness issue is what happens to private investment? Do they follow suit? And the Ministry of Finance is only one player here. What I see at the moment is that the mood is so bad because people cannot understand the framework conditions. The unnecessary insecurities, for example, in connection with the energy turnaround. They stop the investors. Yesterday we had a meeting in Leipzig with lots of participants from the energy sector, larger, smaller companies, chemical companies, and they don't really understand what the framework is. And we had to tell them, well, the speed of the development of renewable energy resources is not going to be lowered. But a lot of people in the room wanted something different. So this insecurity cannot be compensated for. We must realize that the effectiveness of implementation is also based on planning certainty for private investors, and that has to be created by the other ministries. These investments are changing the landscape in a profound fashion. So if we had not found this solution, we wouldn't even discuss how it could be effective. These billions are available now, and now everybody is watching us. You said an investment meter is necessary, Jakob, but we don't have current data. That's always the problem. And the additionality question can only be measured against the scale. If I take the old fiscal plan of the traffic light government, I get the 460 billion, and the 10% rate is no problem. But on the way towards new developments, we are losing funds, and it was admitted that part of the business plan of the government was to fill the budget gaps. This cannot be a long-term approach. We can only achieve what we want by modernizing the state. And this is also part of the 12-point program. If we have the money, the approval procedures have to be accelerated. I'm hopeful in this respect, but these are time periods that are necessary. And in the beginning of this period, a story is important. We have to be reasonable. And we don't know the impact of some of the measures yet. For example, we need more energy, that's clear. But we have to offer more sources to the people, and we cannot write a negative story. To do that, we have to write a positive story. And turning the discussion away from the funding issue is an obvious thing. For 20 years, every year, 40 billion should have been invested in addition to what we invested. And these 40 billion accumulated as a huge gap of 600 billion. So now I have to go forward and tell these stories. So we're doing something, we're modernizing our country's infrastructure, and then we also have to use it. And we have to take other people on board. And this is lacking in the plan, I think. Of course, we want to have this, we want this project to be successful. And we, of course, have to criticize certain steps, but we have to coin a success story. This is what we have to achieve. We shouldn't look back at what we didn't do in the past. Everything that has been criticized is correct, and Jakob said it. We might have investment rules, etc., but what is important is that we're going forward. KATJA RIETZLER, I'm very happy that you're here, because we always talk about these figures and billions and estimates, and everyone has his or her own idea what this is about. But you are one of the experts that really understand the figures and have also carried out these estimates, and you can tell us from the side of statistics and figures how easy or difficult it is to measure what is being done, and perhaps also react to Jakob von Weizsäcker's suggestion. Would an investment meter be a measure that's possible? Or could we use another tool that statistically measures how much of the 5 billion package has already been dispersed? Well, I just wanted to give you the angle of the data user, because I work in a scientific research institution and I analyze data. I brought you some slides that are actually just some buzzwords. And if you think of what comes in addition to what we already have, we can, for example, compare the present situation with the previous period. We looked at different numbers in budget planning that relate to investment. The Bundesbank did something similar. There were some differences, but I don't want to go into details. IW Cologne looked at the planning before and after the amendment of the Basic Law. These are potential approaches. Ex ante, the question always arises, how realistic is the plan? But what I consider important is the accompanying monitoring, and this already creates problems because financial statistics is one statistic basic, and the revenue and expenditure is another one, but it's not very differentiated and a cumulative approach in the statistics office. And then a somewhat more user-friendly approach for data freaks like me is, for example, quarterly financial statistics for the general government sector. Some price adjustments were made and the values are not adjusted seasonally, but the data is easier to come by. We work with original values and price adjustments, and we work on a quarterly basis, so figures change frequently. What is a good approach, which could be developed further, and it's good that we have a representative of the federal ministry, is that the monthly publications by the Ministry of Finance regarding the core budget of the federal government and the states, usually more recent data for the federal government, could be developed further and could then be applied to the federal budget, including special funds, and this would help us monitor what's happening on a monthly basis, and if possible in Excel format with different numbers and indicators, but it's quite a good approach already.
But at the current moment, it's rather difficult. Of course, you can look at it from a broad angle, but when you look at the national pieces of information, you also have to look at the defense spendings, which are included in investments. You have to take this number up because it might otherwise be rather confusing. But, you know, that's possible. It's possible to do it that way. And with hindsight, or when looking into the past, there are some things that need to be analyzed in greater detail, which you can find in statistics. And then the Ministry of Finance also compares the actual with the budgeted or the targeted. I think you're probably familiar with a particular file which is added to the targeted budget. If you compare it to the actual plus the special funds, it's really detailed. It's a very specific and detailed Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't list the individual items, but these group numbers list individual types of spending. Group number 7 are all the measures concerning building and construction. Group 8 relates to other investments, such as the acquisition of plots of lands or movable goods. If you really go that much into detail. And if you came up with such a precise listing, you would actually be able to see what's happening. And this information is always available. It's always being sent to the German central bank at an early stage. And if this information could be published, that would be wonderful. Well, now was asked to talk about this investment meter. And I thought, first of all, no, come on. I don't really feel like that because I don't think it's all that easy. But in view of the limited amount of data available, I thought to myself, well, we've already seen some very good examples. The that clock of the Federal Association of Taxpayers, the inheritance clock published by the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, showing people how much in inheritance they've already lost. I looked at them in greater detail, how they structured, how could they be copied, how can we use some of these components. And I think such a clock, such a meter works very well when it looks at inventory, which changes over the course of time. Because in relation to what's in stock, the changes are not really so profound. The entire system doesn't appear to be rather volatile. And sometimes these meters or clocks are meant to convey a particular message. Well, everything that's in stock is quite considerable, and inventory continues to grow. Now, if you start off by taking stock, I was wondering, should you count down from 500 billion? Would that be the right approach? In the past, you would probably have used a gradual investment meter growing on a regular basis. Now, certain approaches have been developed already, but the problem is, that everything changes every second. Some things are added, things are being taken out. And then you've got to extrapolate a certain amount for the future in order to make it work. At least I think that's the way it works. I have not ever been involved in the development of such a clock, but I think that's how these clocks or meters work. And the question is, how good can the forecasts be? How reliable are they? And how realistic is all that? Do you simply come up with a beautiful image and a wonderful clock, a good meter, but you've got to revise it all in the general public at a later point in time and start off from scratch? I'd like to discuss that with you, maybe with you, Jakob. I'm sure that you've got a lot of better experiences that you can bank on. Thanks very much. I think this provides us with a very good insight by showing that counting is not all that easy. The next speaker might probably not, MIRKO, might probably not be familiar with all the details. Well, there's one additional comment I'd like to make. You have to have a standard. Data are one thing, but we all have to be on a common standard. Are we saying that what was in the budget, in the special fund, which was planned for? Of course, then it will be different if there were certain shifts, because you said, well, for budgetary reasons, we don't only have it in two particular line items. We simply have to be able to measure by a particular yardstick. Yet just you're looking at the yardstick won't be of help, but you have to have some metering units in the system, within which periods of time and how frequently will we measure. That's important, but there will also be a lot of controversy. But this question needs to be addressed at the very beginning, taking into account the data that are already available. Well, we can try to bring it all together later on. MIRKO DERPMANN. At Scholz and Friends, you try to see to it time and again that political concepts can be made public. So you have a vast body of experience in this regard. First of all, what works well when we talk about things which are that abstract? And maybe then later on we can talk about the specific example of the 500 billion. What are your ideas? Of course, we have a lot of ideas here, but of course I'm not allowed to talk about them. But there is something that I can share with you. A lot has already been said, but not by me. So let me take up some of the issues that were already mentioned. The first thing which is particularly striking in this context is the paradox of this big number. It goes in two different ways. First of all, people cannot imagine how much money this is, but people can neither imagine how little money that is in view of the tasks that need to be accomplished. And that makes it very interesting, because in communication, it's very important to turn a weakness into a strength and adjust to the conditions given. It's just like judo, you turn your weak spots into strength. And the other point is nobody in the world, not even Professor Hüther, can imagine how much 500 billion are. That's just beyond our imagination. I just read a political communication and it was quite interesting because you're sitting here because he said the amount that we're going to spend cannot be compared with the size of the territory of the SAARLAND. That's it rather nicely. I spoke to my elder daughter and we tried to, do our math. Just imagine the first human being on the planet, Homo sapiens, leaving Africa, starting to wander about millions of years ago, who looked like us, the Neanderthals. If those people weren't gatherers and hunters, but rather outstanding lawyers with 4,000 euros an hour. And if they had worked for hundreds and thousands of years and not spent anything back then, because that was easy, because then there were no trousers, no shorts, whatever. But if this was a lawyer who had been booked all the time, next Thursday, he would have again earned 500 billion. That's the history of mankind. Of course, it's absurd. Now, you all know Joseph, if he hadn't worked but invested the first euro, then the whole universe would belong to him. This amount is gigantic, and nobody can imagine what this is all about. So this means that we have to assume that in the perception of the people, it's incredibly much. You can see how far it goes. You can't see the end. The second is it's very little money, and that's what people feel like. 18 years ago, I got a job order from a German railway company. We were allowed to develop a small little strategy which made people smile. And we thought that on a name tag, you can write down a little sentence, and I forgot what it is. In the beginning, people told us, well, replacing name tags costs 200 million euros because the logistics is so comprehensive and so many people are working for the railway company. And back then we learned that if you want to change all the uniforms, you've got to invest millions or billions. And here's the same. If you want to change the lights in the bumper posts in the highways, it's so expensive because there's so many, such large a project. And people always think it's a tremendous amount of money, but then you say 2 or 3 things, turn around and the money is gone. And that's a really unusual situation we're in. But it always means it leads to the same consequences. If people don't have a reference point anymore that they can refer to, then it's only about confidence in the people who act or in the institutions that act. That's what it all boils down to, and we're all used to that. If you want to buy a flat and take up a loan of 100,000 euros, then there is a bank manager sitting there finding out whether all the door handles work. And if there are no experts around any longer, then people place trust in you. Same here. The most important point in communicating this measure is the following. You have to try to gain the trust of the people into the actions of the people who are doing it. And there are, of course, various different ways of going about it. One thing is, when we talk about communication, 500 billion are an act of communication as such. It's not just fact-based information and communication follows, but that's how it was used already from the beginning onwards. Look at the phrases that were used: bazooka, turbo, the rocket, the beam, the wooms, the double wooms, the bang. And this terminology will soon be used up, the terminology we used over the last 2 years. So it's an act of communication. Now, it's really important to show that these funds will not simply disappear as people anticipate that this might happen, but we need to offer a long-term prospect, a long-term vision. This big amount, this major effort, this strain which might be imposed on our grandchildren, because this is what people believe as well, offers us a solution, offers us a way out of the situation where we always think small, small. And that is what's so big about it. And that's why we need to develop the right communication strategy. You can't achieve that by informing people about active legislation, but you've got to use beacon projects. There is no other way of going about it. And this is where the big question to go, what are these beacon projects all about? People got used to believing what is in the press. Pensions will go up. Every pensioner will get 70 euros and 80 cents more, but this costs 100 billion. Of course, these are no true facts. I don't really have a clue. I'm not good at doing maths, but this is the feeling that people get. You know, they're tiny little levers which cost millions or billions. And I think now we need to make sure that we can really set priorities, because policymakers have the competence of setting clear priorities and pursuing a clear vision of how to get to the target. And I think we want to reach a situation which is stable, where we're not going to say any longer, well, it's not enough, we don't have enough anymore, the bridge is going to collapse, because that's the dream that people are trying to get to. Because on the basis of the budget, the state needs to fulfill its mandate and its task. And we have to have a plan, and we need to tell the story based on beacon projects. I found it really interesting, and everybody can contradict me if you want. I don't have an idea about the construction industry and how it works, and I don't know much about infrastructure, but the sentence which was made by Friedrich Merz said, we build everything for which an approval will be given, is a very good sentence with regards to a good communication strategy, because he says we can set priorities and we set standards. What we get an approval for is something that will be built. This is clear and unambiguous. And it focuses on speed. It doesn't mean we want to have this and we want to have that, but it rather says, this exists, we're given approval, we can go for it, therefore we will go for it. You can argue whether, you know, this is right in substance. In the press, people always water it down, but it's a clear and very precise statement of where the categories have been defined and determined. And it helps you develop the right communication strategy. And that's probably how it's going to work.
Jakob and Laura, could you immediately answer to that? I did not want to bring all my arguments in my initial statement. A lot of what you just said is already being done. There will be a logo and a construction site sign. We haven't presented it yet, but we're working on it. And in the discussions with the land equalization and other projects, we already got approval for that. And also in your calculations, the 100 billion of the lender is a different story, but it is interesting to see we have 16 cases, how to communicate about the special funds and how people convey the message. I think from an abstract perspective, this is extremely interesting, and the visibility aspect is one of our first projects. I had to learn that it takes several months before you can implement it and have it in all the texts, but this was the idea. And this is what has to go beyond the present government. It will be 12 years that these signs are being used, and it's important that people in their everyday life, when they are in a traffic jam, and there will be more traffic jams because there will be more construction sites, and so when they watch their environment, they see these signs and get the good news that something is being constructed there. Thank you again for your suggestions and inputs. I jotted a lot of them down. We are working on a dashboard. We're also working on a meter. All the questions you asked are also questions we ask ourselves. How can we have a concept so we can give people meaningful messages, and that certain messages are conveyed that we want to convey. For example, with the debt meter, it was very easy to convey the message. And we also want to create transparency. And this is also a negotiation process. We have other ministries who say, well, we want to reduce bureaucracy, and now you want monitoring data from us in certain intervals, because that's another issue of the federal government in the context of modernization the reporting obligations and requirements should be reduced. So we will have controversial discussions. My minister already wrote to the other ministers, and it was in the newspapers, and we are liable vis-à-vis our citizens to show them what we've done. We cannot just do it for ourselves. We are accountable, and we have to create a basis for data collection, and we have to help the lender and the local authorities and not overtax them, but we need data in order to develop appropriate measures and communication measures. And some think about dashboards, we think about dashboards. We have to evaluate the data and process the data in a way that they're meaningful to people, but we also have to be careful not to overtax people. And trust in the players, that was mentioned before, that is our huge challenge, and we don't have that at the moment. I'm not talking about the present government. We know that people lose trust in the government, and you feel it. There are new research data out, and we don't have a situation where citizens are willing to trust politicians. They want to see that we're doing something first, and then they might trust us again. And this is something that worries me, because the special fund has been successfully destroyed by criticism, for example, shifting of positions and items. The negative impression is what the public has perceived. I can, of course, find that deplorable because I work in the Ministry of Finance, but we do something that from the external perspective is great, but internally we always find the deficits and never see the big picture and the positive aspects. We need to be careful to have a good result, but we should not lose sight of the overall objective. Okay, one approach would be to use the big figure. You could use the investment tracker or the investment meter, whatever you call it. So an individual figure is very impressive, but it's more difficult to explain what it means. On the other hand, we could have the beacon projects. What would be the beacon projects? What is so easy to explain to the people with respect to the investment package? Railroads, improvement of transport quality. What is a good approach? Well, we've had 3 years of experience. On the bottom line, I think it is important to do everything that has already been mentioned. It is very important, and I looked it up again. Half a year ago, I talked about the investment meter for the first time. It is feasible. It will not be an exact meter of developments. Should you have it count every second what the actual figures are, or should you have a more relaxed approach? But I think something like that is very important, and it's also very important to demonstrate where you are successful. And this brings us back to sports, where you measure success, and then all the players can notice that we make progress in our country, including the ministries involved. But we should talk about it, talk about successes. And we should not only talk about the railroads or the road projects. I'm also a minister for science, and you shouldn't only talk about great research successes, because a lot of investment goes there as well when I think of the high-tech strategy of the federal government. But all these successes have to be communicated in parallel. But still, in the future, it is important to say what has been achieved after one legislative period. That's very important. If in the end, the situation is such that people said, yeah, you incurred the debt, well, actually, the debt is incurred when the funds are dispersed, but people don't realize it. They say, you now incurred the debt, and what did you achieve? And in many different ways, we should be able to show what we achieved in the sense of accountability. You voted for us and see what we did with the money. This is what we have to do. And for the Saar region, I can say, if you're successful in communicating your achievements, then a broad part of society will support you. And 48 of 51 of our parliamentarians are willing to support us already. It wasn't easy in the beginning. A lot remains to be done, but it's doable. We cannot talk about all the different aspects yet, but the institutions, the ministries, and people who deal with communication have noticed that this is an interesting task and that they are dedicated. And I'm excited to learn what the results will be. But Mr. Hüther, what are the aspects or projects that are easiest to explain? Railroads, schools. You mentioned the completion of a school construction project. What is the best showcase project? I'm sorry that I talk so much about the Saar region, and of course the Saar region is very small, but in the Saar region we intensively considered all these aspects, and we said that the investment should be split up into 3 I's. One I is industrial policy. The third I is infrastructure, and the third I is innovation. And not only factually, but also with respect to communication, you see that different groups in society are attracted by these I's. For example, economists like innovation most, and secondly, infrastructure. And politicians have different preferences. Api and Gustav, you belong into that group. And in certain other groups, the priorities are different. For example, if you talk about the question how the social partners think about these aspects, their first I is probably different from ours, and the sequence might be exactly reverted. So, Thomas, I warn you against insisting on one topic only. Of course, you cannot communicate 50 different examples, but my recommendation is that at least you take an example from each of these areas, one very convincing example, because only this way you can engage society and create a consensus that we're going in a right direction. Well, I think this is an important and interesting perspective, but I would like to come back to your question. What gives you the greatest communication lever? And I think it's transport infrastructure, because it's existential for many people. A possibility to get from where you live to where you work, also in rural areas. And the media already say that the disastrous state of the German Bahn is an example for the disastrous state of infrastructure in general in Germany. But of course, different aspects are relevant, but the greatest lever could be railroad improvements. And this has to be implement it in a reliable way. It's not only about money, it's also about management of the Deutsche Bahn trust, and it has to be better when it comes to performance, and with a new CEO it might be feasible. And then the impact would be great, because reliable transport is a great lever. And I also live in rural areas, and you can not rely on the regional trains. You can just go to the train station at random, because the itineraries no longer apply. So there is a great effect in that area. I imagine communication also consists of images. What would be the image for this investment package? This is not an example for Germany, but the best propaganda image is one I saw 2 weeks ago. Maybe you also saw it. These are two images next to each other, and there is a Chinese person next to a steam locomotive, and in the next image there is a bullet train with 428 kilometers an hour. There are 25 years between these two images, and it's the same person. He was an operator on the steam locomotive from the 19th century, and now he's a bullet train conductor. And that development took place in 25 years. This is an image for his professional anniversary, and this was disseminated by the Chinese all over the world. And if you compare that to German advertising, it is a drastic difference. And you have to understand that these Chinese propaganda images, considering all the systems differences that make it more difficult here than there, show you that we should be shocked and deterred by this kind of communication. We want to also present proud images. And when I see images from Japan, how people use the railroad in Japan, it's such a drastic difference. Japan has had economic problems since the 80s, but their trains still run on time. And I think this is fascinating. And we all know how long it takes. Although there might be optimum conditions until a train is constructed and tested, and I'd like to ride on a safe train. I do not want to live in China either. So some bureaucracy and some checks and balances are quite nice. But then the second question is, what should we talk about? And that is a framing question. The impression is that the special fund is to bring Germany back on track, and the government has to see to it that the money reaches every single person. I have a completely different understanding. This is money we use to prepare our country to become cool again. So we are like a grand hotel where people arrive and everything is a little old-fashioned. The water supply isn't working and the luster is gone. And so now we really invest because we believe there will be guests again and the ballroom will be packed again. So when I talk about beacon projects, I say we should do it together. The government should not construct or develop or sell anything. The government prepares the country. We all prepare the country so it can work and is fit for the future and is where everybody wants it to be. And industry, of course, cooperates, and that do only demand tax benefits or whatever. We do it together. That was a nice example. If you develop it in an industrial area, and if one company doesn't come on board, it's another one. These are people who know their business and it will be successful, but you have to trigger this feeling. And if a new train is now rendered operational and everyone is astonished and the Chinese are surprised, this is the cherry on the cake. But what's important is to go away do away with the idea that 500 billion will be the solution. They just create an environment that makes everything possible.
Thank God you're not Friedrich Merz, who said, well, I don't want to live in China, because he made similar statements with regards to Brazil. Well, I don't speak a word of Chinese, so therefore it's tough. Otherwise, I'd love to spend some time in China. Okay, now we prevented the diplomatic crisis from happening. Mrs. Krause, yes, I'd like to allude to that, if I may, because many of the things that you just said has a lot to do with the psychology. I'm a demoscopic expert, and I looked at the German society for 7 years. What's fascinating about it is that the railway company, even for Germans who never take the train, is a very important topic. So it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, at least according to the set of data. How can we get out of that? This week, a very important study was published on the German identities. What's important to the Germans? That's a topic that we find hard to define. What's quite interesting is that what people consider to be most important in their daily life is diligence and discipline. This comes first. And secondly, the economic performance and achievements of the country. And amongst the top 10, you will also find infrastructure, but, you know, I thought it would be much higher up because I have a déformation professionnelle. But the decaying the economic performance of our country hurts people a lot. And this is what patriotism is always all about, that we always afforded the embargo on since World War II. Even back then in the past, people said, well, made it in Germany makes us be proud of that. And then we had the diesel scandal where people said, oh, there is a dent, something bad happened to us. Now we have to watch out. I don't know whether I'm fully in agreement with you and your Grand Hotel image. I have to think about that, you see. But that's what you said. We can't make any further progress in this country if only the state makes investment and the business community doesn't follow suit. It has a lot to do with psychology. And this is what really is really important to the people living in this country. But the same study also showed that 82% of the people say that they like Germany. This is a much higher value than I originally anticipated. When you talk to Germans and listen to how they talk about Germany, this is a figure that I would not have expected. I realized in recent years that people want to discuss more about what is most important to us in this country. And I would like to seize this project for this particular purpose. Of course, we will have debates elsewhere, not only in the Ministry of Finance, but very often this is the symbol. I think you're doing a lot in the Saarland for the promotion of the pool. The pool needs to be closed, or many shops are empty in the inner city areas. This is what people see and this is what people feel. We have a lot of story about the railway company, and I think in the field of infrastructure, things become very obvious. But at the end of the day, it's going to be tiny, small things on site which will basically change the mindset. The biggest challenge to us in the Ministry of Finance will be that we need to be informed about these things, which are somewhere hidden in the data sets, but are not reflected in the figures that we get. And I hope that we can jointly develop mechanisms at all the different levels for us to be provided with this information about the stories that we want to tell. There's one thing that struck me. At the beginning of the year, a similar study was carried out asking the people where most important investments have to be made. And surprisingly enough to me, most people said education. Education comes first. That took me by surprise. You know, as an economist, you might think about this as a second priority. I'm not really familiar with all the ins and outs, but my imagination told me that this is probably attributable to the fact that each and every one of us, as parents or grandparents or whatever, always went to school at once. And, you know, schools were in a devastated situation. So we have all made this experience. And that is maybe why education is at the top of the list. Because it's all about the immediate and direct perception that people have, and that's what you need. Jakob, please. This was a very important discussion, and how can you communicate it best? And let me try to come up with a systematic approach. I already asked the question, can we cover a lot of different aspects in the course of the communication without overdoing it? The second important question is, can we also do things which do not happen simultaneously and take them into account at the same stage? Michael, I'm fully on your page. You always use the trains just like me. We are deeply convinced of the train system. But, you know, we have our guess. In the run-up to the next national election, the railway company will probably not yet have made the quantum leap that would be desirable. It does not run as frequently as it used to in the past, and is not punctual as it used to be. It will not have reached this former level. So there are things which do not happen simultaneously, and therefore it will be very important to discuss things and communicate the progress which can be made in 3 years from now already. Another important point in the discussion is the question, how can we communicate that things which were better in the past will be improved again? I like the image of the Grand Hotel, because in our infrastructure system, there are certain components which were good in the past, and now they're pretty run down, so we have to bring them up to standard. But in various different areas, and this is one of the weak points in Germany, there are various different areas where we lost the technological leadership. So we've got to get back to the top in areas where it's rather painful that we're no longer in the lead. The Grand Hotel does not help us convey this particular message. It covers a lot of different areas, but it doesn't tell us that in the 21st century, we want to be very progressive and successful and take a lead again. So this is an important question. And if you think about all the 3 dimensions in an appropriate manner, and I'm not the best qualified person in this regard, but then I'm pretty sure that we can reach a success. Michael Hüther spoke about the good side of the bad things and the railway company system again, because he doesn't have to leave us tonight, so he won't be late. Any direct statements on that? I'd like to ask KATJA RIETZLER. Maybe there are some things which force you to be generous, although you're always very particular and very precise. When will it be possible for us to come up with a result which makes us convey the message that a considerable amount of the 500 or 600 billion have already been spent in an effective and efficient manner? You spoke about the availability of data and the like. Can you give us an impression? Well, I have to water things down a little bit usually, because we spoke about the 600 billion. 600 billion which were determined in 2024. Let's just imagine 500 billion. It's less than 600, of course. But it's a nominal value, the 500, not calculated based on the prices of 2024, but at the moment when the money is sold. So the later you sell, the later you spend it, the less you will get for that. So 500 billion in the course of the next 12 years is less than 500 billion would be today, or based on the prices of 24 even. I came up with a calculation, inflation rate of 2% every year over a total period of 12 years. And then based on the prices of 24, you will end up with 441 million. So that's not even 3/4 of what we originally intended to spend. But we know that there might be some delays and postponements with expenditures. Prices for public investments in the years between 2015 and 2024 went up by 3.5% per annum. Not by 2%, as I'd calculated it myself, but then we're even below this number. It's not such a tremendous amount, and therefore it's even more important that we don't do the wrong thing with it. So, looking at it from an optimistic viewpoint, we've got much less than we needed. Now, we have to do everything in our power in order to be able to draw up this optimistic scenario. But some of the previous speakers and also the expert councils also made mention of the fact, and we also learned that we looked at various different plans. Grouping numbers, we looked at the line items of the budget for 26, including special add-on budgets compared to 2024. We had a lot of toing and throwing because in 2024 we didn't have these special funds, so we just had to add them on manually, and then we tried to draw a comparison, considering that from one special fund, 10 billion would be transferred to the new fund, so this amount doesn't have to be counted twice. And then this made us end up saying, well, planning, fair enough. Draft budget for 26 compared to 24, actual 33.5 billion. Additional debts, well, even more. The 33.5 include 8.3 billion to be delegated to the federal states and local authorities. And we assume that not much out of that will be paid out. Previous speakers spoke about this already. And then the amount will shrink even further. This includes line items such as transformation, ongoing costs for hospitals. What does that really mean? If you try to analyze it, it means that certain funds have to be transferred to the hospitals because their operating costs increase erratically in the years 22 and 23. And this makes you wonder, is this a liable line item for investments? I'm not sure. The 33.5 billion are quite optimistic as well, according to plan. But no, we also had our adjustment discussions, major changes were made. But, you know, this figure of 50%, well, we're only looking at a one-year period, shouldn't be overestimated. But I think there's still room for improvements. Since the legislators have taken a lot of action, this should not have happened, because retail and catering in the field of VAT and other expenses should not have been brought about, because this will lead to additional budgetary deficits at the federal state level. And what do? They will use the special funds in order to fill these deficits. And this might lead to distortions and no further investments. So we have to keep a close eye on the statistics. I'm looking forward to the dashboard with very precise data in an Excel spreadsheet format. Very cool, in line with the standard of the Federal Central Bank. Oh, this scares me. I think if you do the math for 1 hour, you will end up with a gross of 780 euros.
Now, the core question, Michael Hüther, is if you look at all these calculations and investments with 500 billion, that your calculation is confirmed? Is that true? Or what would be the next or the future steps? Well, it was correctly described by Ms. Kitzler, particularly when we look at construction costs. We had price increases, and the Undersecretary of State said it. We have to hope that the construction industry is underutilized and we can thus compensate for potential price increases. But the question on the bottom line is, how relevant is what we do now for the fundamental reform of the debt brake? Because it has to contribute to that. How can we have a debt rule for the basic law that is more friendly to investment and creates more leeway? It's not sufficient to tidy up our budgets. It is a permanent task and a permanent challenge. The changes of technological possibilities reduces our economic cycles. If the railroad has a digital hub in Stuttgart, and it might take 2 years longer to realize it, according to present standards, these control technologies will change much faster in the future. So will infrastructure investments not remain at 10%? We cannot do it as a one-off measure. So in the budget, the structure would have to be different. And this is the actual challenge. That we're doing the tidying at the moment is one step, but a lot remains to be done for future structures. Now, this brings us to the end of the meeting almost, but if there are further questions, please give us an indication. Well, first of all, KATJA wanted to answer your question. The question is answered by the rest has to come from the core budget. And what the Ministry of Finance is planning and your considerations here will create a situation where people say it's no longer the question, is the glass half full or half empty? But it's about 75 or 80% full, and then the debate is no longer interesting. So in this context, let me say something. I think we are now confronted with the question, what about our army, for example? If you have such a huge amount per year, 3-digit millions per year, if you spend this taxpayer money or incur debt to that amount, the question is how much safety and security do we get? And are there positive technology spillovers in the process? This is possible, but you just have to manage to achieve it. And the third question is then, as we saw it with the 500 billion, what are the overall economic effects? And I think it's important that what we're discussing here is done in order to improve our record with the 500 billion. But with the defense expenditure, we're only at the beginning of the process, and a very open and honest consideration process is required here. If you ask any questions, then be brief, because not everyone here has a Bahn bonus. I like the good ideas regarding communication, but what I'm still missing is the question, why is this special fund spent? What it is spent for? Is it influencing the investment ratio? But for people who haven't read the 1,000 pages and spreadsheets of the budget, it is not clear. And there were also targets connected to the special funds, climate protection and innovation and transformation. And clear targets could have been established. When the economic experts joined the committee in the discussion of the draft, everyone said you can't monitor it if you don't have clear targets. We talk about monitoring without targets. And this makes it difficult to say, let's assess how good it is, because the question is always, what for? Where are the clear targets and indicators that the targets are achieved? Because then it's much clearer to the citizens whether we achieve our objectives with the special funds and also achieve our objectives regarding transformation and social infrastructure and hospitals. And this has to be highlighted in our communication. Rolf Spachtenberg, I asked the same question. It's a great discussion, and our objective is to implement the program in optimum fashion, but I see a dilemma. At the moment, we want to monitor the disbursement of funds, and this is a dilemma. It is great to implement approved projects fast, but we're not venturing into new territory. We are now able to establish the situation we had before. This is not enough. We have to go further. But it's a dilemma, because if in 2 to 3 years not part of the money has been dispersed, it's a political disaster. So maybe the ministry in the control process could say that in phase A, we have to disperse funds for approved projects, but for certain objectives and targets, we have to formulate pioneer projects. The train is coming. Bye-bye, Mr. Hüther. So pioneering projects might have to be coined. A specific example, Germany won the Olympics in 2040, so we prepare the country for it. We have a fast train network in addition to the regular railroad system. Our system we have at the moment will never be as fast as the train system in China. Well, my buzzword for saying goodbye, because we have a modernization agenda in parallel, and I have to go to join a panel discussion on that. I completely agree with you. For half a year, I've been working for the Ministry of Finance. I worked in different contexts before, and it was obvious that this ministry had to establish 2 budgets in a short period of time, that for the current year and that for next year. And it sounds like a truism, but it bound a lot of capacity to trigger this process. And I completely agree with all of you that now we have to follow this example. And I think this is an initial step. But people want to talk about what we want, how we want our country to be in a couple of years. This goes beyond the 500 billion issue. But I hope that we always, during this legislative period and beyond, have these discussions. Because that is the paradox. We all know that this country hasn't invested enough. But we weren't really interested in investments in the past. So we are all to blame, because we were adults when the decisions were taken or not taken. So for a couple of weeks, disbursement has become possible. A lot of people only remember the March meeting. Well, the special funds have been dispersible only for a couple of weeks. But a lot of work has to be done, and unfortunately I have to leave. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure. Another question? Yes, I can formulate it very briefly. Thank you very much. I have a lot of take-home messages. I learned we need more than the special funds. We also need increase in revenue. And for this, trust in politicians and in players is essential. And I think I sometimes have problems accepting the expenditures that have been decided now, but this doesn't mean I don't want the special funds and I don't want public investment. My question to all of you is, how can we as progressive people get behind the special fund again? Because we all wanted it. How can we agree again that we want a government that funds public interest projects and implements the special funds? How can we bring people together again? That's an important question. Maybe, Jakob, you have a suggestion or an idea? Well, Karl, my perception is not that people are not united. My perception is that when we are united, we want to achieve the optimum result with these 500 billion. And this is important for it to become sustainable and not a special discussion of a few experts who think something is possible. The whole country should see this is the right approach. So I want to make it very clear at this point. I'm very happy that there is the Council of Economic Experts that scrutinizes the situation. I'm glad that they are here, and I was surprised that Lisa Paus didn't insist more on that the Green Party achieved the 10%. We would have gotten lots of other strange suggestions from Bavaria otherwise. I see there is a quality effort for a progressive or a central future project for our country. So I'm not afraid that this doesn't happen. But regarding the question, can we prove that every objective and target has been achieved with a 500 billion at a ratio of 100%? That was your basic question, right? Well, in all relevant dimensions, we will make significant progress. How great the progress will be depends on the question how much waste we have in the process. And also the question Mr. Schwarzenberg raised, by the way, one of the few people in this room who can easily imagine the order of magnitude of 500 billion, because in his time at the ministry, more than 500 billion was spent. So the quality of public finance, as people say, and the question, what happens in the third year, in the fifth year, in the seventh year, and whether everything has been planned reasonably, is an essential question of paramount importance. And I kindly ask for your understanding. It is not surprising that in industrial policy and in infrastructure, we will disperse funds faster. And when it comes to innovation, the disbursement will be slower. Why? To prepare a good innovation process takes longer, but that's okay. And if we look at the lack of simultaneousness, we must accept that there are areas where approval and disbursement is fast, and in other areas approval is fast and disbursement is slow, and there will be areas where both are slow. We have 12 years' time. We want to achieve the maximum success. And if you look at the different departments and pockets of the program, this doesn't confuse us. We can easily explain it. Well, two brief questions. One is, internationally, everyone is for the Bavarians. People were a little bit embarrassed that British football fans criticized Deutsche Bahn. Everyone was embarrassed by that, and everyone loves Bayern München. And everyone together wants to be proud again. I'm embarrassed of my Grand Hotel example. My late great-grandmother would think this is not a very modern example. We should have a common idea, and that is that we actually like this country and we no longer feel inclined to criticize it. There are moments like the BioNTech moment. Germany was proud that a company from Mainz was the first to get this vaccine ready. I think this was a very nice moment. The results that follows were not always good, but it was a great moment. And there are some of these moments in Germany, and there's potential for more. And if we try to harvest what we sowed and get more of these moments when we can all be proud of the results, then this can be successful. And on the bottom line, it's a question of a feeling of community rather than disbursement of funds. This is our special fund and not a special fund that person A has to bring to person B.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much to all of you. Some of us had to leave a little bit early. KATJA, Hüther, Jakob, MIRKO, Laura. We had a very fruitful discussion. We did not really zoom in on that only because, others have done that all the time. So I think we've spent 500 billion, because we can imagine what this is all about. We've spent 500 billion for the reception to come, for some snacks and some drinks. See you again. Have a wonderful weekend. Bye-bye.